Good afternoon, councillors. Welcome to this meeting of the Birmingham Solihull JHOSC Scrutiny Committee. Note to say, if people prefer to wear masks during the meeting, that's okay. That's not when you're actually speaking. May I remind members that this meeting will be webcast live or subsequently broadcast via the council meeting YouTube site, and that members of the press and public may record and take photos, except where there are confidential items. Note if the microphone is at the far end of the room, so we need to bear the microphone addressing the meeting. And secondly, can we, I've actually done this myself, can we formally welcome Councillor Deborah Harris to the committee, and she's replacing Councillor Paul Tilton. So welcome, Deborah. We appreciate your attendance today. Apologies, do other members of this, do we have any apologies other than I have? Declaration of interest. Do members if there are any particular risks of the declaration of minutes? Can I ask the members if they agree that the minutes of the 29th of September are an accurate reflection of that meeting? I was less than able to comment, so we'll go to as happy with them. Got one matters arising which I can go to in a moment. I take it.
My reading of family rules. My reading of family rules.
Thank you very much for that. The matters arising I've got is regarding primary care access, which is on page 8. And that is to receive plan PSOL CCG to intend to deliver improved outcomes in primary care, better support all staff in health services. And we're to receive a copy of the guidance about the territorial triage model. I understand this information circulated to members on 4th of November. Is that correct? Good. Yeah. All members have received that? Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that. So the first item on today's agenda is a mid-year report on the staff enhancement and wellbeing offer. And you've got Lisa Stanley Green, who's here to present that. Thank you, Lisa.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for the invitation this afternoon. So my name is Lisa Stanley Green. I'm the Chief Nurse at University Hospitals Birmingham, but I also am very privileged to wear the hat of System Lead for Birmingham and Solihull for staff health and wellbeing. I started to really pick up a role around staff health and wellbeing just as we saw COVID coming over the horizon. I remember having a conversation with Dave, our Chief Executive Officer, and we were quite concerned about some of the challenges that our staff were going to need to face, having seen some of the footage coming through, particularly from Italy, and some of the conversations that we were having with nurses over there. And also what our leaders would be required to do to keep those staff supported and feeling comfortable and working effectively to look after patients in a very extreme new circumstance that they were faced with. And as time progressed, and we very much started off with sugar and caffeine and drop-ins and looking after people, it progressed into us having conversations with the Department of Health nationally and putting in a bid to become a system that would lead on enhanced staff health and wellbeing, particularly focusing on staff psychological wellbeing through the COVID crisis, and interestingly, quite intensely through mental health needs and addressing those for our staff as well. So what very much stemmed from an immediate need and crisis now I think is morphing into something that we'd like to say is not just for COVID or Christmas, but indeed is something that's important to underpin the retention of our important colleagues and make sure that we maintain all of our staff fit and well through very long and challenging careers in both health services and social care services as well. And it's really that I've come to to talk about this afternoon. We've provided, I think, hopefully quite a detailed written paper which talks to some of the models that we've commissioned in terms of particularly mental health support, but also talks in some detail about some of the things we've done for our staff and some of the things that we want to continue to do. So that's sort of the detail. I guess what I aim to do over the next sort of 10-15 minutes or so is just go through a presentation which perhaps highlights in sort of broader strokes the key elements of the work that we've done, and starts to speak a little bit to what we want to do next, and how we look to sustain this important support for our staff. So clearly we were faced with needing to not only support our staff to be effective in the patient care around COVID-19, but we're in a context that staff also have their own anxieties and their own fears. And if you think back to almost 2 years ago now, there was a very clear message, wasn't there, in terms of people that didn't need to be out of work, to stay at home, not be in the workplace, work from home where possible. But for health service, social care and other key workers, it was very much come out, be on the front line, deliver the services that people need. But that fear and concern that people had, who were then able perhaps to go into their homes and feel a little bit safer, that was really challenging for our staff, because they had to come out day in, day out and deal with very different circumstances in their workplace, deal with very many more patients presenting at any given time. And some of what we faced were quite significant numbers of rapid deteriorations of patients, and patients dying in numbers and in areas of our hospitals that we were not used to that. And that was particularly challenging. I think there was also a really significant challenge at the time on those colleagues who were working in social care, and particularly those colleagues working in residential care homes and nursing care homes, where the national strategy had been to make space in hospitals so that we could care for the patients who were coming in with COVID. And interestingly, we set up what we called health and wellbeing hubs. So they were safe spaces, quiet places, comfortable places within our hospital sites that enabled staff to get off the units and spend a little bit of time having a cup of coffee, talking to somebody, finding out what support was available for them. And we had many donations. We had a wonderful warm reception from the public. People were celebrating the work that we were doing, and really people were getting by in that extreme state on sort of caffeine and sugar. One of the first things that we did, because what we recognised with a large workforce that's dispersed across many organisations, across many sites, was that we needed to develop a skill set within a number of our colleagues to be able to be amongst the staff in general and signpost them to psychological wellbeing services. So there was something about how did we get people out there into all of the corners, so onto the IT units, into the A&E departments, into the medical wards. How did we get them out there to then be able to share that message of, are you okay today? Is everything all right? Or do you need some support? Do you need a bit of time out? Do you need a bit of help? So one of the first things that we did was we provided psychological first aid training, initially to around about 800 staff. But after a while, we found that was a really good way of connecting in with colleagues right on the front line to identify those that would benefit from wider help. So we extended that, and we now have more than 1,400 staff trained across NHS and social care organisations, and we continue to roll that out. And certainly the feedback is that ability for people to spot if somebody's not quite on it on any particular day, and either have a cup of coffee with them or suggest that they might want to go and talk to somebody, has been immensely valuable. So we'll continue to do that. We also put on an enhanced offer for our leaders, because the responsibility, again, that some of our leaders were taking on was beyond some of the experience that they previously had. So directing and leading and supporting a workforce in normal times is challenging enough, but leading people who are worried, anxious, feeling perhaps that they're not doing as good a job as they want to be doing, brings particular challenges, and I think required of us a need to equip some of our leaders with the permission and the skills to be able to say, okay, we don't need to do everything all at once. We don't need to rush things. We can take time. We try to talk about a culture of compassion within our organisation, within the partner organisations, so that what we were doing was tuning into people and hopefully leading people in a way that was comfortable and not adding challenge to the challenging circumstances that they were already facing. And we did a number of live broadcasts. A number of those were presented by psychologists that work within Birmingham and Solihull Health Trust, and we tried to sort of listen in to what our colleagues needed and then respond to that in terms of expert speakers and people that could talk to them about broader experience. We had a number of webinars delivered by people who'd had military experience of military combat, and some of the stresses and pressures that leaders feel within an unusual and highly pressured context. We provided more physical as well as psychological support clinics for staff. And one of the things that you often find is where we'd ask staff to work in different areas of the hospital and perhaps work in situations where they had been on a sort of desk-based type job, and asking them to work in more physical environments and wards and around patient care, that, you know, they were experiencing some musculoskeletal issues and stuff like that. So we offered direct access into physiotherapy and other MSK support services. So I think the whole ethos that we took was that if we already provide it and our staff need it, let's do that at the same time as we're looking after the patients, because it's in our gift, it's the right thing to do, and we know that it would have those added benefits. And we've also looked at commissioning and developing some digital resources, so giving people information through digital platforms, through apps, through our website, and we continue to explore some of that. And there's some really good staff health and wellbeing offers around transitionary issues that people experience as well, such as the menopause, bereavement, and those are quite a good adjunct again to specific services and specific counselling around bereavement and other things that people experience through their lifelong careers. I think the thing that I perhaps wanted to pay some attention to in this meeting was to talk about the staff mental health hub that was commissioned. It was one of the first of its kind in the country. We were very early to recognise that it would be something of value to our staff. And we have really good working relationships with Birmingham Solihull Mental Health Trust, and speaking with their psychologists, very quickly recognised that we could set up a fast-track pathway for our staff, so that if they were experiencing quite acute mental health problems, so they'd gone beyond the I'm feeling anxious or psychologically this is difficult, so things that weren't low level that we could manage through simple psychology or counselling, that we could actually fast-track people into a triage system, and then when necessary they could go straight into mental health treatment. And we've actually had a number of colleagues who had significant diagnoses, post-traumatic stress disorder, very extreme anxieties, phobias, and to this day I've got staff that talk to me now about what they're experiencing, the things that they see when they go home from work in their quieter moments, and the way that their sleep and other productivity is affected. So we established that. We got some good funding in from the Department of Health, so quite quickly we were able to tap into national resource, and we were established as a pilot site in Birmingham Solihull for the National Health and Wellbeing Programme. And there's just some facts and figures that I've provided here in terms of some of the access to those mental health services, so some of the activity that they've been undertaking, and some of the spread of cover that service has provided across health and social care organisations. Unsurprisingly, and early on, quite a large amount of that contact and activity was from our own staff at University Hospitals Birmingham. But increasingly, we've seen GPs accessing that service, we've seen social care workers accessing those services, and people from other employing organisations as well, so our community services, and indeed the mental health services themselves. And we're starting to get good data through now in terms of what our reach is, who knows about and understands the services, and what types of people are accessing them. I particularly worry, I think we're quite low in terms of access from our medical workforce. I think, You see nursing quite strongly, people coming forward and talking about how they feel and that they have needs. I'd expect to see more of our medical colleagues at this point, and I think that's a real challenge for us to reach those people and reassure them around the confidentiality and the acceptability of accessing these kinds of services, because we know that medics do struggle at times psychologically and on occasion with mental health problems. Again, good uptake from therapists, and we're currently in partnership with Birmingham University doing a commissioned evaluation of that service. I've had a strong indication from the Department of Health that they're looking to continue to fund it into 22-23. So other than actually in black and white yet, we've had strong assurances that that funding will continue. We can continue to commission this service. But I think, this is something that we're going to need for many years in an acute phase of crisis and post-crisis. But probably it should be in place for all time for our staff. I think it's part of a good relationship between employer and employee. We clearly need to increase support for our staff and retain them throughout their working lives. I think we're quite ambitious as a system. I think probably in terms of being able to get funding in, being able to stand up services pretty quickly, services that are being accessed by staff and that we're getting really good feedback about. We are getting really ambitious now about how we extend that and how we extend the reach of it and the understanding of it across all of the staff that we employ in health and social care, which is more than 100,000 across Birmingham and Solihull. So we'll continue to innovate around that model, but certainly exploring more how it can be accessed remotely as well as in person when that's suitable and that people know about it. We want Birmingham and Solihull to be the best place to work. Health and social care are massive employers in this area. We've got the potential to, enable social cohesion. We've got the potential to enable people to enter good, positive careers that are enabling for them and their families and their communities. And we're really clear about the place that we have in that and the responsibility that we want to take. And in terms of, the young population, we want to bring new colleagues into health and care, but then we want to look after them too, because there is something about who looks after the people that look after all the people, and I think that's a strong challenge for us, strong message for us as leaders. We're undertaking work to better understand who our workforce are, their needs, and particularly their needs around retention, support, and keeping people well and healthy for longer in their careers. Historically, particularly nurses, medical staff have tended to retire earlier than they will be able to in the future. And what we want to do is make sure that people remain healthy and productive for all of their working lives, and that work actually enhances their whole life and is much more of a holistic offering. I think the partnership working going really well. I have to say, I've met just personally so many people now who work in the leadership level across local authority, across care, as well as the NHS. So in terms of us extending our scope and working with very many more partners across the patch, that's been an absolute joy, and working with the authorities has been really productive, and I know that they really appreciate some of the stuff that we bring as health colleagues in terms of access to services that they might not have within their own place of operation. So we've held a workshop which included all of the NHS partner organisations and all of the social care partner organisations as well, and some other partners that work frequently with health and care, and talk to them about what is the strategic offer that they want going forward. And that's where we come out with this sort of system of excellence and this 4-element plan that will form our strategy going forward. So largely it's about understanding need. It's about balancing what we can do in terms of supporting people with physical as well as psychological and mental health. And as I say, through those pivotal life-changing moments where people might temporarily be struggling with circumstances out of work, that we can support them through a work context. We do want to better offer in terms of a commissioned occupational health service for all of our people, and we think that that would be a great benefit. There will be a national framework published quite shortly, but we think that some of the learning that we've done over the last couple of years will also inform that model that we provide for staff. And then we just need to think about what are the implications around funding that and the sustainability of it, and then the colleagues that specialise in that area. So our plan is to commission the mental health hub certainly for next year. It's very pleasing to see Paul and David here, because then I can just mention that from next year, I would probably expect the centre to want us to mainstream funding through the Integrated Care Board. So we'll probably need to talk about that. But staff health and wellbeing is one of the strategic priorities of the integrated care system. So we know that people are very supportive of this work, and we know that people are very committed to taking it forward. What I and the team need to do is make sure that we express the value to our commissioners and make sure that that value is felt and appreciated by our staff and has the right outcomes. So I think that's a bit of a whistle stop tour. I'm very happy to take any questions that people have, and hope that that's been helpful in terms of updating around some of the work that we're currently doing.
Thank you on behalf of the whole committee. I certainly enjoyed that, Lisa. So members, any other questions? Anything, Colin?
In the report, on page 2, there's coverage of PFA trained staff members. Is it the data from those still being cleansed?
We're just verify. So we'll probably have it on paper from various different organisations, because everybody sort of sends it into a central point, and then we'll put it together into one piece of data. So it's this interesting thing now that we have this amazing opportunity to work collectively as organisations, but generally one organisation will take the lead on then collating the information that comes through.
The other thing was some of the participants. Was the ambulance trust part of this? It's close cousins.
They're very close cousins and very important. So the offer was very much for Birmingham Solihull. West Midlands Ambulance Service, I understood, had their own national offer for them, so they weren't included in part of theirs. Having said that, their crews that attended our sites were welcome to participate in some of the stuff that we had on offer. And for example, we had lots of stuff going on in the accident and emergency departments where they wait, so they would have had access to some of that. But interestingly, they're a regional organisation rather than pertinent to Birmingham Solihull. But they're good colleagues, so we can never turn them away.
Yes.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Thanks for the presentation. Looks like some good stuff. 3 questions. The third under the physical sheet, physical wellbeing hub, the Birmingham not responded, Birmingham City Council. Just wondering why that was the case, and we can then encourage their interest. Number 2, is the Community Healthcare Trust engaged in this? I didn't see a reference, and looking to know if they're involved. And thirdly, funding into next year, it's encouraging some positive signs coming out. Is there anything our committee could do, maybe to write to some party to say how much we wish that funding to be continued? And if so, who would we write to?
Okay. So in terms of the council, what we have is we've still got some funding available this financial year around the wellbeing hubs. Some of the complexity we've had is how we identify a state that's suitable and accessible for people to then access the hubs. So that offer went out, and we actually think of some really good people here at the council. And a lot of their staff work in very dispersed community settings. So having something just in one place. So for us in the hospital, it works because, you can have it on the floor somewhere and people can get to it roughly. But offering something to a more dispersed workforce is quite complex. So what we've talked to them about is how we could do virtual things and do other stuff around webinars. There's the access to psychological support, how we can get that through the council comms. And I have to say that the colleagues that we work here in the workforce department are absolutely amazing. They've been brilliant. In terms of the community gap, they're fully involved with us, and there are aspects of the offer that they've taken up. Interestingly, you know, as I sort of think about who's access services and why, I'd expect them almost to start accessing stuff more in the new year, because if you think about how the pandemic has evolved, usually it's the hospital services that are impacted first. Then often it's people that are impacted as things go out into the community and follows those patients. So we'd almost expect to see a swell of need following the initial sort of acute need that we've seen in hospitals. And that's why I'm quite keen that we keep it going for a significant period of time, if not for always. In terms of the who could you write to, thank you, that's a super offer. Really appreciate that. We are just currently doing an evaluation that will go back to the Department of Health in terms of firming up the funding. So yes, it would actually be very helpful to have some feedback from you that we could perhaps put alongside that evaluation that we send back to the Department of Health. And I think, and that's one of the reasons it's so great to come out and talk to people about this, is I am really keen that the people that have stood this stuff up get the support and the resources that they need to keep growing it and make sure that it's the right thing for our people. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you for getting to to contact County Secretary.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you for this report. I appreciate that there's clearly a lot of work that's gone into this, and I very much appreciate that. I have a few quick questions. The first one I hope is a quick technical question. The pie charts on page 4 of the report, there's some red on the left-hand one, which I can't see in the key. It's only a small amount, but I was just wondering what that was.
I'm not sure.
Okay, that's no problem. Maybe we can follow up on that later. The thing that stood out to me there was the relatively low proportion of social care workers who are engaged in this. And I know you said elsewhere that you're looking at ways to reach out to social care, so that's good to hear. In terms of the things that were fed back by staff, I was absolutely not surprised to see musculoskeletal as the top one on that list. I'm a clinician myself, and I do treat a number of NHS staff, both within Birmingham, Solihull and elsewhere. I'm aware that we've been asked not to raise personal issues, and it wouldn't be appropriate in this forum anyway, but I wonder whether there might be an opportunity to provide some feedback on some of the things that that experience has suggested to me would be very helpful for some of the staff. I mean, I'm aware that there are certainly things, reasonable workplace adjustments that could perhaps go a long way in helping that. So maybe we can arrange that outside of this meeting. On a similar note, I noticed when you, in the table on page 6, you talk about physiotherapy, identifying and proactively supporting staff when they go off sick and supporting their return to work. I mean, my perspective is that in an ideal world, it would be nice to provide that before they're in a place where they have to go off sick, and being a little bit proactive about that would potentially make things much easier in order to prevent them developing to the point where staff are having to take time off, which is not ideal for anyone.
No, and I think that's the point of us having a proactive occupational health service, because at the moment it is very reactive, it is very referral based. I mean, we've done some quite simple things in the last couple of years, like allowing a broader, better range of footwear. That's made a huge difference, particularly to nursing and HB colleagues. So, no, I'd absolutely agree with you.
That's great. And like I said, maybe we need to follow up a little bit more outside this meeting. The final point that I was going to make was around the amount of the support that's taking place online and in digital ones, particularly when we're talking about managers, for example, where a lot of it being provided by this sort of webinar training and things like that. I'm just very aware that a lot of people are suffering from Zoom fatigue, or more widely digital fatigue, and that online offers are not necessarily able to provide the same things that in-person offers do. I fully appreciate the benefits for reaching people who might not otherwise be able to engage, and I think for some people they work really well. I suppose it's just quickly not to forget that some people find it really difficult to engage online, even if they have the technology and the skills to do so. A lot of people struggle with various psychological reasons, and just sort of making sure that alternatives are accessible to those individuals. That would be.
I mean, some of the things that we're finding now is that the impact of so much stuff being virtual is having its own negative effects on people.
Yes.
And that needs to be part of the broader offer as well. So we've certainly recognised that. The other thing is musculoskeletal issues emerging associated with home working.
Yes,
and people
absolutely.
just moving, just not even going from one platform to another at the train station and things like that they used to do. But for some people, it's meant that they are much less active than they were before.
This is something that I spend a great deal of my working life talking to people about. So I'm glad that you picked that up. And on the home working, again, I think, I'm sure you've thought about this already, but one of the things I hear from people, not particularly in the health sector, but just generally, is that they feel an obligation to respond to emails outside their normal working hours because they're there, and because that's their office environment and they're working more from home. So it becomes a case not so much working from home as living at work, which obviously is much less helpful. Is that something that's on your radar?
It is. And the other thing is, in terms of how this piece moves from the kind of responsive health space into shaping leadership attitudes and organisational cultures, because I think that's really important, because the ultimate place to get to with this is that people feel valued, they feel respected, they work in a good team that's supportive, and they have good working relationships at work, and that absolutely work has boundaries that don't leak into impacting their personal lives. And I think certainly when I talk to staff, that's what they're looking for. I think in the near term, a bit of stability is really the core. And then I think from there onwards, it is this sort of compassionate culture where people are supported to thrive, rather than us fixing people that have got broken because we've opened up.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for all of that. And once again, maybe we can catch up later and add your other comments.
Okay, thank you. We've got 5 minutes left on this section, so Councillor Cobb, you want to question, and I've got a observation. Councillor Cobb.
Referring to page 7 of your book, could you tell us a little bit more about the activities of the Wellbeing Gardens? Wellbeing
Gardens, yes. So, and it's interesting, this is sort of a new term that's emerging more broadly across the NHS. So for some time, we've had a role within organisations called a Freedom to Speak Up Guardian. So somebody that oversees and ensures there is the right climate for people to speak up and speak out. My understanding, and I'm sort of a designate health and wellbeing guardian, and we'll look to have one in each of our partner organisations. But the sense is that you commit your time, your energy, your thinking, and your efforts to supporting this agenda and to making sure that the climate is right within your organisation. So I'm accountable to my board in terms of how we deliver this within our own organisation. As we morph as a system, a health and care system, into the integrated care service, I'm accountable within the people board that's part of that governance structure. So I'm accountable to the chair of the people board and ultimately then to the ICS that I ensure that people working on this get the right support and get the right resources, and that we're delivering on the strategy that's been agreed ultimately by the board that will be. So I see it as, this didn't start as my day job. My day job is as a chief nurse, and I've got lots of things that I do that are purely chief nurse type things and UHB specific leadership things. But I just feel so very strongly and passionately about our people, about supporting our people. And actually, if I haven't got enough great people who are well supported in my trust, we can't look after the patients as well as we want to. So, there are lots of motivations for me in terms of leading on this. And I suppose it's that thing about, in the NHS, almost giving you a bit of a hat to wear that's called Guardian, that just supports the fact that you are doing this role and you feel strongly about it. And I think it also then identifies within the organisations that this is important, designated somebody to take responsibility for it, and we want it for our people. So it does make me smile a bit though, because I think about that film like Guardians of the Galaxy and going up in the spaceship and saving them. But anyway, that's it's a new terminology. At least it's not a 3-letter acronym, which we're also very good at in NHS.
Thank you for that. Councillor O'Connor, that's one of the questions I was going to ask. So this is just really an observation. On your referrals by job role for staff and mental health, you make indicate that the medical referrals are far lower than the nursing ones. Is that possibly a cultural aspect? Medical staff don't get culturally. It's something we should be admitting to, that this is a potential issue for us, and which would be help you actually challenge that, and how much of the underlying problem do you actually think that actually is.
Yeah, and I think it's a really interesting one. There's a lot of research been done around medical cultures, behaviours, nursing cultures, behaviours. Increasingly, we try and work, and certainly in our trust, we try and work as a multidisciplinary team and look after each other. But there is something about the culture in which people have grown up, learned and developed, that there's a varying degrees of acceptability, of recognising that perhaps you need to seek help. Or others suggesting to you that you might need to seek help. So, but we'll do work with those groups specifically in the next year, because certainly for me, it just looks, in terms of the colleagues that were out there, dealing with very difficult stuff, it just speaks to quite a low uptake in terms of medics coming forward. Although that's not to say we didn't have other things as well that people could access, and it might just be there's need that was met, but it was met through different ways.
Thank you for that question, and thank you very much for your talk. I really appreciate it. You obviously start to say thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we've now got the H2 planning and development programme, and we've got 4 step.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Suppose you haven't met me before. Take my mask off and you might be able to hear.
We've got 45 minutes for this particular item, so if we could move in the presentation to the summary, and that'd be appreciated.
No problem.
Thank you.
So for those who haven't met me before, my name is Paul Athley. I'm Chief Finance Officer at Solihull CCG. There's 3 sort of sections to this presentation, Chair. Just to picking up your point there, perhaps if we could take them each in turn. I'm guessing you may want to focus more on the operational performance elements early on in the slides, so they're probably not 3 equal portions. But if I talk through the first section and then stop at that point, take some questions, and then move on to the finance afterwards. You're probably all aware of the context of planning in the NHS this year, but unusually we're working in 2 half years. So when I refer to H2, then that's the second half of the year from October 21 to March 22. So funding was provided into the NHS in 2 separate chunks, and we have national and local priorities that have been set for those periods. You've got a slide deck already in your pack, so I'm going to focus my time just on 2 slides, if that's okay with you. So if we could just move on to 2 slides from where we are now, which is the one with the 4 coloured boxes. So if I could just take you through the 4 main areas of operational priority that we've been planning for in the second half of this year. So the first one around workforce segues nicely from Lisa's presentation earlier. So it's fair to say that our workforce continues to be the biggest priority and potentially our main barrier to the pace that we can recover services from the COVID pandemic. Whilst our workforce have been working incredibly hard during the last few months and continue to do so, we obviously are looking at where we can start to expand services, start to increase the pace of recovery, and to do that we need to have a healthy and available workforce. What we've started to see over the last few months is that the absence related to COVID has started to to reduce, but we do still see overall sickness and absence levels within the services at about 1% higher than we saw pre-COVID. So having an available workforce to us is therefore going to be really key for us to deliver against our national priorities. One of the key focuses, therefore, in our planning has been around how we can support our staff to work effectively and how we can look to retain the staff that we have currently in the system. And a lot of what Lisa's just talked through to you there supports quite a big part of our workforce planning for the second half of the year. In addition, we're also looking at how we can recruit more staff in to support the services that we want to provide. And we're going through particularly quite a big programme of international recruitment at the moment to try and support that, whilst also encourage local staff who might have left the service in the past or may be interested in joining the service to come and support our overall numbers. With regards to primary care, again, you'll be well versed on a number of the primary care priorities and access challenges over the last few months, and you also referred at the start of the meeting to some of the planning that's already in place, a document of which you've had shared. I do want to just pick up on the fact that, as you'll probably be aware, the government has supported health systems through the release of primary care winter access funding, and as part of our planning for the second half of the year, we've been looking at how we can utilise that funding to particularly support some of those primary care access challenges. In particular, we have a number of primary care surge hubs that have been set up, so one in each part of the city, who are providing around about 400 additional appointments a day to support patients who otherwise would be accessing urgent care services. In addition, we're also looking at how, at a more local level, we can support individual primary care networks to develop additional local face-to-face capacity for their individual populations, and that's part of our key plan for the second half of the year. With regards to urgent and emergency care, which has probably been one of our biggest challenge areas over the last couple of months, there's been a lot of focus in the media around the increased demand on our urgent care settings, and particularly the challenges with ensuring that there's a consistent flow of ambulances across the system. We're actually on target with the national priorities that have been set to us around a number of those urgent care pressures. But that's not to say that there aren't further things that we can look to do. And I can talk you through a little bit more later around some of those particular areas. But if I just pick out two to begin with now, we're looking at how we currently redesign our front door access. And there's quite a bit of work that UHB are doing around, particularly starting on the Hartland site and then rolling out into other sites to look at how we can introduce an enhanced triage service at the front door to ensure that the right patients are getting the right support that they need at the time that they need it within emergency departments, but also that we're utilising other capacity that we have available within primary care, within pharmacy, within urgent care centres and other parts of the system. We've also looked to try and enhance the primary care support that's available within emergency departments, and we now have a primary care screening service within each of our emergency departments across the Birmingham and Solihull to ensure that, again, those patients who are sick but possibly don't need emergency help can easily access healthcare supports when they enter the emergency department. The final area, which is probably the area where, from a national targets point of view, we've got our biggest challenge, is around elective recovery. Perhaps I could ask you to go on to the next slide, so that provides a bit more detail on that. You'll be fully aware that accessing elective care has been very challenging over the last 18 months. Waiting lists increased substantially during the first wave of COVID, and whilst there's been a significant effort from all health partners to start to address that, we're still not at a position where we are delivering the level of activity that we were able to deliver pre-COVID. And obviously, as you'd expect, if we're not delivering that level of activity, that has a knock-on impact onto the number of patients who are waiting for treatment and the pace at which patients are able to access that treatment. The health system has been set a target to stabilise waiting lists at the level that they sat at September 2021 and to reduce or at least hold the number of patients waiting over 52 weeks. There's also a very specific push around patients waiting over 104 weeks. That in itself is an uncomfortable thing to discuss. We would, pre-COVID, have never even considered the possibility of a patient waiting 2 years for treatment, but that's the unfortunate situation that we're in at the moment. And our health partners across the system, as you can imagine, are walking that tightrope between making sure that we are treating those patients who are in our most complex and in most clinical need of support and treatment, whilst also looking to make sure that patients aren't waiting those really excessive times for their treatment. So if I take those areas in turn, from a 104-week wait perspective, we are expecting to see quite a significant reduction of patients who are currently waiting over 104 weeks over the course of this 6-month planning period. So we expect to reduce the numbers down from around about 1,280 patients who are in October of this year who are waiting over 104 weeks, down to a target of 212 by the end of March 2022, with an ambition to reduce that further down to 0 in the early part of 22-23. It's worth putting that in context that if without some of the actions that are identified in the slide here and in your pack, we would have anticipated that number to have increased to over 3,000 by the end of this planning period. So quite staggering numbers. We don't, however, expect that we will be able to meet the targets of holding numbers of 52-week waits and to hold the overall waiting list numbers to the levels that they were at September 21. Towards the end of this presentation, we start to discuss a little bit the multi-year recovery plan that the system's developing, and as we start to be able to share more details on that, that will help to answer some of those questions that I'm sure you'll have about when we will be able to start to achieve those targets. If I just do pick out a couple of the areas which we are focusing on to reduce those numbers waiting, and particularly to focus on those really long waiting patient numbers. There's a lot of work going on in our hospitals about ensuring that theatre capacity is utilised effectively. And in particular, we've been working on something called the Perfect Working Week over the last month or so that starts to look at what we would need to have in place to make sure that flow works as effectively as possible in each of our settings. Part of that is around what we've termed Super Saturdays. As you'll probably be aware, healthcare is 24/7, 7 days a week service, but from an elective care point of view, most hospitals tend to plan to do the majority of their elective work on a Monday to Friday. So when we do look at the capacity that we've got available as a system in terms of physical theatres, beds and workforce, the one area where we potentially have the opportunity to push that a little bit further is about working over the weekend. And so we've been working with teams to look at how we can develop these Super Saturdays where we put the right infrastructure around our theatre teams to really push through as much activity as possible. Clearly, that has to be planned in a really sensitive way, given that from a workforce perspective, our ability to work and put through additional activity at the weekend does rely on our existing workforce stepping up and doing additional sessions to do that. And we're very conscious about creating that balance between maximising the capacity that we can generate, but also protecting our staff and ensuring that we don't reach a position where that might create challenges for them. But that is something that gives us that additional capacity that's helping us to stabilise where we can those waiting lists. It's also worth pointing out the third bullet point on there. One of our real priorities, as I said, is to ensure that we are treating the right patients with the capacity that we've got available. So one of the things that we've asked all of our clinical teams to do is to review those high-risk patients on our waiting lists and ensure that harm reviews are undertaken to make sure that none of our patients are into any harm during that wait, but B, that we have a really clear understanding of those patients that are in need of urgent treatment, and that treatment is provided in the appropriate time scale. Third bullet point there about returning people waiting 62 days or more to February 2020 levels. That refers to the 62-day cancer target, where patients should expect to start to receive their first definitive treatment within 62 days of being referred into a healthcare setting. That's a target that has been challenging for us to achieve, partly because of the capacity issues that I identified, partly because, as you would expect, there was a significant amount of unmet need during the original COVID pandemic, and we started to see a flood of patients coming forward who would have otherwise had undiagnosed symptoms during those lockdown periods. So that's created an additional level of pressure into the system. However, we do anticipate that we can considerably reduce our 62-day waits down. In October 2021, we were in a position where we had double the number of patients waiting over 62 days that we had pre-COVID levels. Our planning and some of the actions that we're putting in place would suggest we can get that down to 130% of pre-COVID levels by the end of this financial year. We expect to get back down to that pre-COVID level quite early on into 22-23. Touched on workforce already. The final area there is around supporting patient-initiated follow-ups in a number of our outpatient specialties. So this is very much about ensuring that we utilise the capacity that we have available within our medical workforce and nursing workforce, in particular those workforces that are supporting our outpatient services, and making sure that we only see patients who need to be seen. So there's an opportunity around patient-initiated follow-up in certain specialties where it's appropriate to use it. In other specialties, it's not so much. Where patients have the opportunity to put themselves forward for follow-up. However, if they're comfortable that their condition has been managed and there is no reason for them to come into hospital, and then equally there's a communication route there to work with our clinicians. We've been encouraged to set up patient-initiated follow-up in 5 outpatient specialties. We've got that working well in 4 currently: dermatology, musculoskeletal, endocrinology, and gastroenterology. And we're looking at taking the learning from that before we roll things out further across our hospitals. If it's okay then for you, Chair, if I pause there and take some questions around the operational planning and things, and then I can move on to the finance afterwards.
That's what proportion, looking at the waiting list management, that's what proportion of no-shows you typically have. You have a surgical team standing by, and is there a strategy for stand wait lists? Some of these surgical things will be 2 hours where you have one team just waiting.
Yes. So one of the things that we're actually doing to sort of try to manage capacity is to put a bit more support into to contact patients before they're coming into surgery, to make sure that they are ready and there are no issues. And obviously, from a COVID perspective, there are quite specific rules that we want our patients to follow. And so part of the pre-op assessment process within all our hospitals is to ensure that there's a communication with patients beforehand. Each of our hospitals will have a standby list of patients that they can look to call on at short notice. And I know my previous experience as a CCG was working at the Royal Orthopaedic Hospital, and all patients were asked when they entered the waiting list whether they would be prepared to accept a short notice cancellation or not. And those are added onto a standby list. That's not to say that it is always possible to achieve that, but there are certainly processes in place that look to maximise the theatre efficiency as much as we can in that circumstance.
Thank you very much, Chair. A couple of quick questions. The first one is around workforce shortages. So you've identified that as a key area that we need to work on. And I think that's important because obviously while it's possible for the government to throw more money at these things, it's very hard to magic trained healthcare workforce out of thin air. It takes time to develop that. So in the context of national workforce shortages across the healthcare sector, what can we do locally to try to overcome that challenge?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. Obviously, with my finance hat on, I'm used to finance being a constraining factor in everything that we're doing, and the reality of the situation at the moment is we are sitting here with enough money that's being provided by the government to do the things that we want to do. It's the fact that we haven't got the workforce available that is really constraining that. I think that first and foremost, some of the steps that Lisa discussed earlier are probably our biggest priority at the moment. It's about making sure that the workforce we do have are in a position where they're able to support us with what we want to do. But in terms of recruitment, I think I mentioned earlier the fact that we're looking at international recruitment as possibly one area that is more of an immediate answer than some of the longer term planning that we would need to do nationally to attract numbers into training schemes and to work forward there. So we have a 3 or 4 year international recruitment programme that we supported as a system. There are 40 international nurses that we expect to have recruited and trained by the end of 21-22, and a further 40 that we expect to be in place by that point, but going through a training programme. So that's probably our immediate area of focus to bring a more short-term solution to that. I think the longer-term solution is much more tricky locally. It's much more regional and a national approach to how we can firstly ensure that there are enough training numbers in place. And certainly one thing we did see post the initial COVID pandemic was an interest in people to either come back or come into the health service. And the government helpfully ran a national campaign to encourage people towards that. So I think the action for us is really about working very closely with Health Education England and with our local universities to ensure that there's appropriate training numbers in there, and then to ensure that we've got those links with those training providers to ensure that those trainees tend to stay in the city. I think one of there's plenty of research out there at the moment that we tend to be a net exporter of trained staff. So a number of students will come into the city to the training places we've got available and then take their skills back out to the leafier areas of the country. And I think there's a lot that we need to do there in terms of working with the universities to create a hook for those people to want to stay in the city.
Thank you. My second question was around the urgent care settings, and you mentioned putting in place enhanced triage processes. My concerns around this, and I think we discussed this when we talked about the NHS 111 system previously, is that a lot of the time it seems to be replacing sort of triage conducted by a person with sometimes triage conducted by an algorithm, an artificial intelligence system. And I'm looking for reassurance around how these systems have been tested, the safety of these systems, and how we know that they aren't generating an inequality impact, whereby people who are better able to express themselves and to explain their symptoms will tend to get better outcomes.
That's a very good question. I think what we're keen to do is to try and find that sort of sweet spot between ensuring that we've got the right personal connection where that's necessary and vital to be used, but also to look to see where digital solutions can help to enhance and give us additional capacity that otherwise we wouldn't be able to access with the workforce challenges that we've discussed before. I think to answer that question in detail, I probably need to take it away and then consult with some of my colleagues in the provider setting who would be involved more closely in that. But certainly the triage models that we're looking to put in place are to provide a combination of in-person and digital solutions to help with them.
Great. great. I would be very keen to hear more about that.
Yeah, I'm very happy to take that away.
Chair, sorry, I can answer Councillor Sexton's question on the triage model. So I've commissioned some work on this. So these models, Councillor Sexton, over the period, to the Heartlands Hospitals report said we've had our ICS, or Integrated Care System, clinical lead, as well as nurses, going to test these models, and they aren't initially about AI, they're about people triaging the different groups. So that concern you've got that this is AI driven, that's not the case in the first instance. So what we put in the first instance is additional capacity to make sure that patients are making on users.
Great, that's good to hear. Thank you for that reassurance. My final question was just around communication, and I'm wondering whether more can be done to communicate with patients around, particularly when there's a delay to their treatment, as what they can expect. Because I've heard from a number of people who feel like they've been left hanging, sort of had an operation cancelled, but they don't know where they are, that leaves them, or what to expect next. And also around some of the appointments, I'm hearing from people who may have had some confusion as to whether an appointment is virtual or in person, and where that communication hasn't been very effectively managed. So I'm wondering whether that's something that you're looking at or can be looked at as part of this process.
Yes. Yes, we are absolutely looking at that, and twofold really, as you say, both to provide better assurance to our patients and citizens, but also to look to try and free up time and capacity of our clinicians or administrative staff who otherwise are having to manage that uncertainty with patients. I'll go on in a little bit to talk about some of the additional funding streams that are being provided, and one of the things we're looking at through one of those funding streams is the potential to develop, and this is an early stage of thinking, so don't quote me on the name yet, but the equivalent of a customer service hub, so somewhere centrally where patients can contact rather than having to everyone going back to their GP, so I haven't heard anything from the hospital, everyone going back to the medical secretary, somewhere that has that information that's available from all health settings across the city that they can contact if they are unsure about things. And likewise, hopefully proactively starting to contact those patients who haven't heard for a period of time to ensure that they're fully up to speed. We're still scoping that out a little bit at the moment, but I think we recognise some of the challenges there. In terms of that sort of the communication to patients, again, I can take away a question to my provider colleagues in particular detail about the level of information that's provided on their letters. I can anecdotally sort of feedback from my own circumstances around the fact that some patient communication, in my experience, has been reasonably clear on whether they're virtual or face-to-face attendances, but I can certainly go and get some more clarity from my provider colleagues to make sure that is being front and centre of the communication with them.
That's very positive. Thank you.
What I think comes with the schemes into mitigations of maximising the capacity. Could you expand on that a little bit for me?
Yeah, so it's fair to say, whilst a lot of our challenges here have been exacerbated by COVID, there were lots of things that we were doing pre-COVID, whether that was around workforce maximisation or productivity, that equally apply to the settings that we're in now. So each of our hospitals have their own productivity programmes, which is about ensuring that if we do have capacity available, we do have staff available, that we get as much activity through that as possible. Councillor, his first question around making sure that we don't have downtime because of patients not attending is one of those areas. I know, to give you another example, there are some programmes in place that look at how quickly we can turn around theatres between patients. So again, just looking at we've got 8 hours in a theatre session, looking at maximising the amount of cutting time, in it, for want of a better word, that we use there. Certainly a lot of work around flow through hospitals, particularly supporting discharge, and that's a massive issue to us, both supporting our urgent care pathways, but also supporting that elective care work, to ensure that we're able to do the PIT work we want to do. We have to have critical care capacity for those complex patients who may need critical or intensive care after their treatment, and we need to have a bed for those patients to move into. And certainly with the pressures that we're seeing in the system at the moment, that's not always the case. So we have a number of programs that are looking at how we can speed up some of those basic operational elements about making sure that patients have their drugs on time, that they're clinically assessed for discharge at the most appropriate time, and then that they've got the right support when they are discharged, whether that's into a community care program or whether that's into a package of care at home, and making sure that those processes work swiftly, then speed up the line and make sure that we don't have patients that are cancelled, and we avoid any situations where we actually have funding and staff capacity that we're not able to use. So it's a number of those efficiency programs that we're really focusing on at the moment.
Yes, thanks, Chair. I think 104 week waits 2 years. I think all astonished that here was somewhere wrong. Can you just remind me again of the numbers of individuals we're talking about here, and any indication of the spread of treatment of specialty those all across? And secondly, 52 weeks again is obviously not what we want to see. So again, you have a figure for how many people we have waiting more than 52 weeks, and again, distribution across different treatments.
Yeah, so for patients waiting over 104 weeks, we were at 1,285 patients in October 21. And we anticipate that to go down to 212 by March 22. It is worth noting that we had no patients waiting over 52 weeks for treatment prior to COVID. So that the Birmingham Solihull system worked incredibly hard in the 2 years prior to COVID to reduce those long waits down. There were in some very complex specialties. In 2018 and 2019, we did have patients waiting over 52 weeks, so we got that down to 0. So that is something that absolutely has been driven by the COVID pandemic and the ability to treat patients during those peaks. In terms of patients who are waiting over 52 weeks for treatment, in October 21, that number was 32,458. So very significant number. That's around about 10 to 15% of our overall waiting list.
Across the specialties?
I don't have that broken down at a specialty level.
Yeah, so Councillor Pocock, the 4 surgical specialties, in particular, ENT, urology, I'm sure you've looked at the table, and ophthalmology, general surgery, all that, the 9%.
I wonder, Chair, if I may propose that this is clearly, we all agree this is not a situation that should be like continuing at all possible. I'm noting your challenges to the recovery because we don't know what's coming, and therefore the ambition to get this better may yet be thwarted. Do you think we could have a bulletin or a little table, monthly, quarterly, just so we can track in 2 meetings how this is progressing?
Yeah.
Just put it down one labor specialty, 104 weeks, 52 weeks, month by month, we'll meet again in the spring, and we'll get through how this is progressing. But clearly, this is a headline issue for everybody. I think it's right how committees should be alerted to how this is going, and alerted to any possible changes that could damage even the ambitions that you already have.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect reasonable request. As you'd expect, we have those reports already set up, so we're very happy to share some of the reports that we're already producing with you.
Do you possibly have those ready for 10th of March meeting next week?
Well, happy to circulate in between meetings, but we have to give an update at that meeting as well. I mean, we'll move on to the multi-year recovery plan that we're developing, which we'll specifically sort of target those, how we're going to start to address and resolve some of those big challenges. So I would imagine at the next meeting, they will be interested to hear more about that.
We've got about 12 minutes left on this
Okay.
section. We've got 2 sections to go through. So
Yeah,
we can move through that in a timely manner if possible.
no problem. And I think that the area we've covered already is probably the area of biggest concern. As I mentioned earlier, from a financial planning point of view, we have been supported to ensure that there are resources available to do the things that we want to do. So if I just quickly pick out some points here. So our overall allocation to the second half of the year is actually very similar to what we saw in the first half of the year. It was by and large rolled over. We did receive some additional funding to support pay awards for our staff, and also some additional targeted capacity funding. Started to see the reintroduction of an expectation around efficiency levels. So efficiency top slicing was suspended during the first 12 months of COVID. As you'll see from the slides, there are some efficiency targets that are being passed through into the health system at the moment. The ambition as we move into integrated care systems is that the government will push more and more money down to systems to control locally. However, I think because of all of the pressures at the moment, there are a number of national funding pots that are held centrally that we have to ensure that we have appropriate plans in place to access. So the next slide describes some of those quite material areas of funding that we're currently accessing. So we have the opportunity to access 11.6 million of hospital discharge programme funding. This has been absolutely vital in ensuring that we've got the right community services in place to support that flow we were discussing before. Quite an important one to us because that funding does cease on the 31st of March. The government has been quite clear that there will be no further funding for that into next year. So one of the big pieces of work we're doing with council colleagues, because a lot of this overlaps with social care, is to look at how we can ensure that those services are embedded and running sustainably as that funding is reduced. I've touched on primary care when to access funding already. You'll probably recall in the first half of this year, a lot of the funding to support elective recovery came through the Elective Recovery Fund, and we have to meet a set of targets to access that. Because of the specific pressures we've seen around COVID in Birmingham and Solihull, we don't expect to be able to access elective recovery funding in the second half of the year, because we don't expect to be able to reach those thresholds of pre-COVID activity that's required. It's been acknowledged nationally that there are some systems, and particularly in the city systems, where that's quite a consistent theme. And so what's been called the targeted investment fund has been introduced for those systems to be able to specifically put forward programmes where additional support is required. And we've been successful in receiving 13.4 million of revenue funding and 16.8 million of capital funding to provide additional capacity. In particular, to put a significant amount of additional ward capacity onto our UHB sites, which will help with that flow, make sure that we've got enough beds to be able to treat both our urgent care pathways and to keep elective activity flowing. And that's quite a big part of the multi-year recovery plan that I've discussed. And also to support some of the digital transformation that will help better connectivity between our partners. So as an example, supporting more digital communication between the ambulance service and the front door hospitals, so that some of our clinicians can help our paramedics to treat patients at the scene and not need to be conveyed into hospital to get help with those pressures. I know you're always interested in efficiency schemes, and as I mentioned, we're only seeing a partial reintroduction of the efficiency targets that we're being looked to deliver. But I have provided some information on the final slide about some of those efficiency schemes that we are looking to deliver. It's fair to say that those sort of traditional transformation, service redesign schemes that we might have discussed previously, that we might have looked to have in place to release cash from the system. And anything that does provide an efficiency improvement is simply being recirculated to provide additional capacity into the system. So conspicuous by their absence, the fact that we wouldn't have those sort of transformational schemes. So the efficiencies that we are looking at are very much ensuring that we've got that real sort of transactional control of the funding that we're able to. So some of the schemes there that are described are around prescribing schemes, making sure that we're doing effective prescribing reviews with our patients and that ensuring we're only prescribing those drugs that are required. Continuing healthcare, again, making sure that we have those robust processes in place to assess patients and start to step them down at a time where it's clinically appropriate to do so. And I think we also mentioned on there around enhanced assessment beds, so that probably is one that's a little bit around looking at the service model. Because we found during COVID that one of the things that became apparent was we had a significant plethora of enhanced assessment beds, quite often a handful of beds in different settings, and that made it very difficult for us to operationally use those effectively. So we started to look at how we might consolidate those beds in such a way that we've got an ability to make sure that we're properly getting the best use out of those that has both a service benefit and a financial benefit. I mentioned that the providers are still working on finalising their schemes, which they have done subsequent to these slides being shared. It will probably come as no surprise to you that the majority of the provider schemes are focused around those sort of better procurement kind of arena. So one of the things in particular is that our providers are starting to come together for those products that they traditionally had procured as individual trusts and look at the sort of volume discounts that we can generate by procuring those as a system, and that plays quite a big part in terms of the provider efficiencies that we're looking to achieve. But there are also some schemes around e-rostering to make sure that we are using our staff in the most effective way. Reviewing some of our drug contacts, review maintenance agreements, those sorts of things that aren't pulling our clinicians away from frontline work, but are making sure that we are using the funding that we have in the best possible way.
Hello. Thanks. Thank you, Chair. One thing that you did mention on there, which was quite interesting, when you talked about the NHS linking very much in the social care time, basically trying to keep hospitals and more of their home, which is where they recover much faster. And also key to see as well improving joint working, which hopefully gets you identified, I think you alluded to it, some cost savings, which will be reinvested back in. I think that's one thing. Things to see how as well. Very impressed with the ambulances having looking at when going to a patient, is that they're able to do something triage before they go to A&E, which again is a very good thing. The one thing that both of I've talked about on a number of occasions is about the doctor's appointments in A&E. So I'm just wondering about potential pressure, financial pressure, because people are not being able to get into such appointments as they were, how much financial pressure that is putting on the NHS.
Yeah. So to pick those up in terms, absolutely, I think that there are some real opportunities in terms of how health and social care can come together to use our resources more effectively. So as an example in Birmingham, the early intervention programme that we've been working on jointly, health has ensured that all of the funding related to the early intervention programme has been included within the Better Care Fund this year. So there's this complete transparency between both parties. On the ambulance conveyances, just to give you a bit of an idea, through the digital work pilot that we've been doing to date, we've seen a conveyance rate of around 25% of all patients who've been reviewed virtually by our A&E staff. That compares to around about 50 to 55% conveyance rate generally. Maybe not complete apples with apples, because obviously there are certain patients will go through that, but it gives a bit of an indication around that. And in terms of the doctor's appointment, I referred earlier to one of the uses of the primary care wing to access funds around providing additional primary care surge capacity, which I suppose provides that middle ground between patients who aren't able to access their own GP practice, but have a condition that can be managed in primary care and doesn't need to go into A&E. We're anticipating spending something in the region of £2.5 million in the second half of the year on that model. So that gives you a bit of an indication of that pressure and the cost of that.
I'm thinking, Chair, as it's just been alluded to, is the winter pressure with the appointments to the doctors, plus the winter pressure through and what have you. And now we've got the new COVID virus that's also putting up and potentially putting more pressure on you as well. So it's having more pressure to follow. So we've looked at something to one side to whatever.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I think there's enough money in the system for us to deliver the things that we want to deliver. The challenge will come over the next 2 to 3 years as that money starts to absorb about how we ensure that we retain the models that work effectively and pull out those sort of costs that aren't being used effectively.
Thank you.
Yeah, so this is more to whet your appetite for a future conversation. But as part of our system planning, we were asked by NHSEI to deliver a recovery plan for this financial year. Clearly, we're very aware of the fact that the solutions that we need to put in place to manage those pressures aren't going to be either fully in place or certainly delivering to the levels that we need to deliver to by the end of this financial year. So our system locally determined that we needed to develop that recovery plan in much more detail over 3 to 4 years. That's in the final stages of being completed. It's been a joint process between all of the providers and the commissioner within Birmingham and Solihull, which, as the slide describes, will involve quite a significant amount of activity modelling and starting to model in some of those interventions that we discussed earlier, and focuses both on our elective waiting times and reducing that recovery, but also ensuring that we can have the right models in place to manage urgent care, reduce those ambulance handover delays, and make sure patients aren't waiting in hospital. So we're going through a process at the moment of finalising that and then iterating that in conversation with NHS, E&I, and we will anticipate to have something that we can talk through in much more detail as we get into the early part of 2022.
Thank you. It sounds like there's a lot of change going on in quite a short space of time, which obviously is inevitable to COVID. Is work going on to keep an eye on the impact that all of these changes are having on patient outcomes? Is that something that you're monitoring closely?
It is, as you say, in a normal world, we would be doing a smaller number of significant transformation programs. There would be a very clear structure put around those to ensure that those benefits are being fully realised. One of the challenges that we've got at the moment, we are absolutely monitoring those patient outcomes. One of the challenges is because there's so much transformation happening at once, it's going to be quite tricky to work out which of those interventions that are having the biggest impact. So that is something that we're very much aware of. As I say, we certainly have those metrics in place, and we're thinking through how we might be able to differentiate some of the impact to be able to monitor that through. It's a key part of our planning moving forward. So as I say, we're going to have to determine over the next 12 to 18 months which of those interventions we want to embed, and which of those that we decide to reutilise the funding in a different way, or that forms part of the clawbacks and the funding that we've got.
Is there a role for patient feedback as well as the data on outcomes in determining?
Absolutely. And I think that it's certainly it's a much more nuanced approach to measuring the overall outcomes, that both from an activity and numbers point of view, but also that some of those softer elements of feedback that have formed part of what we're doing.
Thank you.
The last question for this section.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'll be quick. The additional funding we've got 11.6 from hospital discharge and then targeted investment. I presume that is also just in this financial year. We're only 4 months from the next financial year.
Yes.
What do we know about the prospects of either those funds continuing to next year or the second next year? We're very close to needing to know that, presumably we've made some assumptions on that. So what assumptions have we made and what indications we had that's about what next year's second might be? It's not
Yeah, so we don't know next year's allocation mix, although we expect to find that out this month. We've had indications nationally that the feeling is it's as good a settlement as we could have expected in the circumstances when you look at the funding that's available for the public sector services. But we do anticipate that the additional funding that's been in place during the last 18 months will start to drop away, probably over a 3-year period. So we will have to improve productivity to match that reduction. In terms of the specifics, we have been assured that there will continue to be a mechanism for systems to access additional funding to support the recovery programme. It's likely to be a revised version of the elective recovery funding, so there's been some acknowledged feedback that it doesn't work for all systems. We haven't seen the detail of that yet. We would expect to be able to access some additional revenue support to support those targeted investment fund areas. We have also been asked as a system to acknowledge that we may need to find local support from the traditional growth monies that we would get as a system to support some of those. The one that probably is exercising the majority of my time at the moment is around hospital discharge programmes. As I say, we've had very clear indications that funding will stop. We're working very closely with council colleagues to look at things like the Better Care Fund, to look at some of the service development funding that we receive for ageing well and for other community services, to make sure that we embed those things that are working effectively first before committing to new things that we might otherwise think to use that funding for. Because we do, there are a number of elements of our hospital discharge programme at the moment that are absolutely vital to making sure that our recovery programme continues.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And the next item we've got is the ISC update on the road scrutiny, and we have James Melford from Birmingham Solihull ICS. And so the topic of the price will go to the episodes. I think we've got 40 minutes possibly for this.
Great, thank you, Chair. Hello, everybody. It's good to be face to face and actually on virtual today. So you asked us when we came last time to come back and update where we're on the development of the Integrated Care Board, it's called the ICB, and Lisa said we do write 3 letter acronyms in the NHS, and we continue to do that, which is due to be the new statutory organisation that oversees healthcare across Birmingham and Solihull from the 1st of April. Now, at the moment, the Health and Social Care Bill is in the Lords, and the second reading is expected to come in December. If you read some of the press, it's on many of the words around that. We've been told very clearly to plan for the 1st of April launch of the new statutory organisation. It's important in the context of the call that Lisa, because we set up that new statutory organisation at probably the toughest time for NHS in its history. You might have thought COVID was the toughest time, but if you're working in A&E at Heartlands at the moment, if you work in the mental health ward, in the Pickham ward over at BSMHT, and most of the patients have got COVID, and we are some patients out of area, it is incredibly difficult for the process of really so. So it's a difficult context in which we're launching the organisation. And just to remind members, what's the Integrated Care Board doing? Well, it talks to many of the things that I've heard you ask questions about. It's about improving outcomes for our population. It's about tackling inequalities in outcomes. So those waiting lists that Paul's talked about, what my colleagues at UHB will do is making sure, and this is one thing that we have to do, is that there's equality in the patients on those waiting lists, and making sure that people from our most deprived communities are treated equally with those in less deprived communities. So we've got to do that. We've got to enhance productivity. Paul's mentioned next year, apart from the settlement, we'll be honest with these going to go down. It's compared to what we've got now. We've got record levels of investment in the NHS. As Councillor Pocock wisely said, some of those are non-recurring. We've got it and then finally, we need to support the broader economic development and social development across the Solihull. So that's what the Integrated Care Board does. Now, our job at the moment is to agree the constitution for that Integrated Care Board. I just want to talk you quickly through that, because I think this is an important context of the work that Sophie's been doing and talk to you about in a second. So the Integrated Care Board has got to look to start bridging the gap between our partners in health and social care. And we have to design a board that does that. We are constrained by statutes on that. But our board, Solihull, we'll be talking to colleagues such as Paul Hamilton, Councillor Greensell over at Solihull about the composition of the board. We'll have 5 independent non-execs in there, and they will be independent. We have to advertise for those non-execs. One of them is the chair, David Buckland, who's already opposed. We've already got a non-exec who focuses on inequalities. That's Patrick Burnings, a professor at Northampton University, an expert in the area. We have to have a non-exec such as remuneration, and given what Lisa said, so that non-exec will have to contribute as well. We have to have a non-exec, and we'll have somebody who will apply support, so we work for. So that's the first set of people on that board. The second set of people will be like me, executives. So there has to be a chief executive, chief finance officer, chief medical officer, and a chief nursing officer. That's what the law says. And we've said we're going to have 2 more executives on the board. And this links into what Sophie will talk about in a second. The first of those is somebody who looks after our partnerships, looks after place and primary care. So one executive director does that. And the last one is somebody who looks after our strategy, the strategic commission. And as we design this, the key issue is subsidiarity. What we mean by that is we will be looking to delegate as much as possible to where decisions ought to be made closer to patients, closer to the public, whether that's in our providers, whether it's in collaborations with providers, whether it's at place, Birmingham or Solihull. So we'll be looking at part of our place design group. I've talked to you about place previously. We are working with Nick Page over in Solihull and Graham Betts in Birmingham to make sure that we get that right. So the final group of members on that board are what's called partner members. This is what's new. 2 of those will come from our NHS providers, one from acute care and one from mental health, community and learning disabilities. 2 will come from primary care, one from Solihull, one from Birmingham, and 2 from local government. So 2 local government officers will be on the NHS board that has the oversight of the NHS local. The oversight of how we allocate the nearly £4 billion a year that we get in, how we are delivering performance against things that Paul's talked about. Now we've got to talk to the chief executive, the chief exec at Solihull to see who that might be. They have to be officers in the whole. They can't be members. That's Integrated Care Board. Over and above that, there's a joint committee of health and local Integrated Care Partnership. And we are looking over the next few weeks into the new year to bring our colleagues together to design that Integrated Care Partnership. Because that's a joint committee between local government and health. It isn't a health body, and it shouldn't be a health body. And that sets a strategy for the health and care system for the future. And then we have place. As I've said, place is from the engine groups doing this. We want to delegate more than place. We've got 2 places, Birmingham, which has got 5 neighbourhoods, and Solihull, which has got 2 neighbourhoods, or is it 1 neighbourhood? One neighbourhood. So we've got 2 places and 6 neighbourhoods. So that's the IC, what's called integrated care system. And I talked to you about that previously, and we are looking to develop that start shadow form probably in February 2022. Again, we work with the health and wellbeing boards, we work with the officers to make sure we do that in a sensible way. Now, one of the things that you asked us about is how does that infrastructure fit into scrutiny? Because it's quite a complex infrastructure. And to be fair, there's limited formal guidance on the role that scrutiny will play once the ICS becomes a statutory body. So we've looked at that and we'll talk about that in a second. And I will tell you from my colleagues in health, and sometimes a nervousness about scrutiny and about the writing out of adversarial sort of process. We want to get over that. I personally see scrutiny as a positive thing, something that brings the citizen to the centre of delivering the health services. It's fundamentally about integrated care systems and integrated care boards on Bham. So the piece of work that Councillor Power asked us to do, you asked us to do, was look at how scrutiny fits into this. And that's what we're going to talk about at the moment. The same figure, thank you about safe work on this for the last few weeks. And I think she's going to talk to you as part of this. She's going to talk to you about what she's heard and what our recommendations are. So,
Thanks. So this is a really short and rapid review of scrutiny. As we've mentioned, there isn't anything really in formal legislation or guidance around what scrutiny will do in the future. The only things that it's quite clear about is that you need to build on what's there today. So it's very much an area where it's probably in our gift in terms of how do you want this to work and how do you want it to function in the future. And we're talking lively now. So project 1. Okay, so one of the things we've done is a small number of interviews with people around this table today. Also talking with CCG colleagues around their experiences, and I've done quite a lot of desktop research of what is out there in the world around the experiences of ICE going through the country, around what's important, what makes a difference. One of the lenses that I took through this was really asking people around what works well today, what would this be an opportunity to improve, and going at it from that basis rather than necessarily using this as it's a blank piece of paper that's completely changed things up. So one of the ways that you'll try to kind of play back the findings is very much around success criteria. So around what is actually going to help to make this work successfully. I think the first one there really builds on what David was saying there, that scrutiny has a really important role to play for developing ICS. So the ICS is something quite complex. I spend a lot of my time working in systems. One of the reasons I love doing that is because it's really complicated and there's no easy answers. But when you're working in it, I think particularly it takes a scrutiny approach that can make it quite challenging to kind of know where to prod, what questions to ask, and what that looks like. I think it's also fair to say that as ICS has really become formally constituted from the 1st of April, or as David was saying, maybe not. There's a lot of change happening quite quickly, and whatever we end up with on the 1st of April is probably not what it's going to look like a year, 2 years later. There's a lot of development that's going to happen in that time. And I think that makes a really strong role for scrutiny to be working alongside the ICS as it goes to learn what it needs to do and what it needs to do differently. And I think primarily behind all of that, again, as you were saying, David, the reason we're working in this integrated way is around building better persistence for patients and the way of doing that. And I think that's so at the heart of what scrutiny is designed to do. So any challenge that can come to doing that will be really clear. Also, from my conversations with people, there was good discussion around how ICS is potentially make scrutiny a bit better as well. So there's an example used around how sometimes when talking about an issue, you might bring different providers together who work on that issue, but they might not all be speaking to the same source of data. They might all be kind of talking at slightly cross purposes. And one of the things you can hope is you work in a more integrated way with a scrutiny perspective, you might be able to, have different kinds of conversations, which are also much more holistic. So the second success criteria I put forward is that ICS and scrutiny with common understanding and shared objectives. A lot of the reading I've done from guidance is it talks around where scrutiny works really well. It's a two-way relationship. It's not something that's done to another organisation. It's something that you can develop together. And I think it's probably fair to say that not all health partners are used to being scrutinised in the way that, in a local authority context, it's a very normal thing to do. For some health providers, it can feel quite intimidating or, something to be endured rather than something to kind of welcome. There's a real opportunity to kind of create a shared beneficial relationship there. Something that was recommended in a lot of the guidance was that as ICS become formally constituted, is actually an opportunity for ICSs to also start to determine how they think they want to be scrutinised. And I don't mean that in a protective sense in terms of only ask us these questions, we don't want to answer these other questions, but really for them to also start to articulate, well, how do we look at ourselves as successful? If we're not hitting these, this is where you need to kind of work with us on that. And think again about that two-way relationship. I heard a lot about different beliefs. So a few people I spoke to talked about, the importance of, election cycles and what that can do, in the scrutiny cycle and having to be mindful of that. It was interesting from my perspective as well, having worked with the NHS for a while. When winter comes, that is a really important cycle as well. And I spent a lot of my time talking about strategy and governance, and I'll say that's a much harder conversation for me to have in January than it is at other times of the year. So there's a sort of rhythm to sort of understand and work together. And then the final sort of thing that came through the guidance, and I think I've sort of seen it work really well here today, is making sure you've got appropriate time to discuss things. So when it comes to ICS, it's very complicated. It takes time to go through it. You need to make sure that you've got the time to kind of scrutinise it properly and not just be racing through. The third success criteria is around the importance of strong relationships. And certainly when I was sort of asking questions around when does scrutiny work really well, when is it more challenging, a lot of what I was hearing back from people is it was really important to spread the relationships. So it's about the preparation that goes into a meeting. It's around the briefing papers that are doing that side of things. It's about maybe you have a meeting that doesn't go so well, but then what learning can you do afterwards and how can you start to kind of play that back? And it was interesting to kind of hear about scrutiny as this really ongoing relationship. It's not this sort of point in time, you'll come here today, you'll account for yourself, and then you're a few years out, but it is much more something that you'll kind of work together on over time. And I think when it comes to ICS development, that's going to be really, really clear. And I think as well, the importance of individuals working sort of an officer level and also at a councillor level as well, how those sort of come together, build things over time. And I think shared learning is really important as well. Having those sort of both formal spaces and informal spaces that you can work together on that. The fourth area was around being clear about the roles and responsibilities of system boards and forums. So you just touched on two of the key forums there around ICPs and ICBs. There's also going to be forums that are going to happen at place levels, so place-based partnerships, and then you also mentioned that below that there's also locality levels. So it's not easy, this stuff. There's all these different spectrums around what this is going to work on, and a lot of the work that I've been helping more broadly in governance is around trying to kind of really define what happens where. And I was impressed that one of the things that was shared with me was the ways of working document from Birmingham City Council around this is what scrutiny does, this is what Health Watch does, this is what health wellbeing boards do. And I thought that was really good articulation, and I think something that we can really build on from that sense as well, because every level kind of mentioned there, scrutiny has a role to play. It's not just at one level, and I think the more that you can start to describe that, the more you can sort of describe that better. And something else that's quite interesting is a lot of people do scrutiny. People have different roles of scrutiny from different areas. So I mentioned sort of health wellbeing boards and Health Watch. They also kind of have a role to play as well. And one of the things that was quite interesting, I was reading about other systems that they've done, that actually convene these like ad hoc meetings where they brought together regional NHS regulators, local authorities, Health Watch, health and wellbeing boards, all sorts of groups together to do things like sign off sort of key boards. And I thought it was an interesting thought to consider as you develop, that you can maybe take some different configurations. So being really clear on what everyone's role is and who does what, but also giving some opportunities to come together. Finally, the final success criteria was that ICSs will develop over time. A lot of the guidance is like this could be a time to actually sort of define a new culture. And what I mean by that is, I think you do need a really good challenge. Like there's a real case to be doing this. And I think if I think around sort of the pressure that you guys are under in terms of, what has to be done by what date, a lot of things are happening really, really rapidly, having to be done very quickly and doing that side of stuff. So it's really helpful to have a good relationship with scrutiny to sort of take a step back, see the bigger picture, not just kind of meeting those little milestone objectives, but are you meeting sort of the bigger things you need to do. But one of the things that might be something to consider is around risk and how we view that. Because one of the real ambitions of working in an integrated way is you want to try to do things differently. And part of doing things differently is doing things that might not work. So one of the things that you kind of want to be seeing at an integrated care or NHS level is trying things out. And I think that's something kind of interesting to kind of consider, because a real risk might be that the ICS doesn't do that. It doesn't try new ways of doing things, and then you never solve doing another way. And I wonder if that's kind of an interesting thing from a joint scrutiny sort of perspective to consider is how do you create an environment where that can be done safely and in an accountable way, but also how can you kind of work out if things are working and how do you move on quickly and on to the next thing. I think all of that ties back to the ongoing relationship and having that sort of shared view. Could you just go to the next slide? And you did warn me about your delay, so I'm happy to after a second. We've come up with a few recommendations against each of these areas in terms of things that we think we can now practically do. So the first one around having, that scrutiny has an important role to play. David mentioned that they're putting together a constitution at the moment, which is really sort of milestone document developed by the ICS, and an opportunity to kind of state what's important, what do we want to do. And I think there's a real opportunity to kind of be really clear within that and governance around being explicit that scrutiny is an important thing for us to be doing, and this is the role that we see it playing. Not every system will be doing that at the moment, because as I said, it's not a huge feature in terms of this is what you need to do, but I think it's an important stage to do that. In terms of common understanding and shared objectives, one of the suggestions around that was a knowledge sharing session. So using a sort of open session where you can have sort of those questions, and honestly, I've worked in systems for a number of years now, and I still have lots of questions all the time in terms of how things worked. Having a joint session to kind of go through what does this mean, and then using that as a way to set the shared plan. So what are the sort of topics that we want to consider over time, what that might look like, and doing that in another way. On strong relationships, one of the recommendations I have there is around, I think it's important to have consistency of relationships as you go through this. So while I don't mean this in a gatekeeping way, I think it's really important in the new ICS ICB structure, there's a named individual who's responsible for doing this. So that are my recommendations. The executive director for place primary care and partnerships that David mentioned, it would probably be best suited to be there. What they do is not necessarily they're the only person who speaks to by any means, but they act as a good first point of contact to develop. They can also, within the ICS as well, work bringing partners together, briefing them properly, making sure that you get the information you need, and always be kind of working with you to kind of develop that relationship as you go. I mentioned the next recommendation around the ways of working document. I think we've had a start at that in terms of describing what it can look at different levels. But I think certainly as some of the governance becomes a lot clearer, particularly around place, it's going to be really important that we kind of nail that really crisply. And I think that that's a good sort of objective to come together. And then finally, in that sort of changing relationship and developing over time, and this has come through a lot of the recommendations and guidance that I've read, is around taking lots of time to take stock. So whether that's after a meeting that worked well, that didn't, or in a periodic way, sort of saying, I just don't feel we're getting what we need from this, and could we do this in a different way? Sort of making sure you build that into this, because I think a lot of system working you're learning as you go. Because it's all brand new in many ways. I'm happy to just take you through the final few things that we shared here, and then I'm happy to take any questions. So I had a bit of a go in terms of talking about the role scrutiny at the different levels and sort of using the ways of working and document that we shared with me to sort of start to describe how that works between health scrutiny, health watch and health and wellbeing boards. And I also sort of used that as an opportunity to talk about the ICB, which David mentioned, which is the thing that sits at the top, sets the strategy, all focused on like big ticket strategic things like health inequalities and really building on health and wellbeing boards. The ICB, which will be responsible for many things, but allocating resources, being accountable to NHS regulators and oversees performance of the system. The place-based partnerships, I think this will be really key. They're going to have a really key direct relationship with health and wellbeing boards. The health and wellbeing boards will probably be overseeing what they're doing and helping to kind of inform the direction that they take. But at the HOSC sort of level, there's going to be a really important role in making sure that there's oversight there. And then finally on that list, we've got locality forums, and that will be at Birmingham only level, because as we were saying, there's only one locality under Solihull. These are probably much less well developed, I think it's fair to say. That's something being worked through at the moment. So whilst I think it's hard at this stage to say exactly what the relationship would be there, I think what there is an opportunity to do is probably for scrutiny to support the development of those localities, because a lot of the purpose of having localities is around being close to communities and speaking for citizens, and that's something that I think we're well equipped to kind of help to shape and give advice here. And then the next slide is very much about developing ways of working. We've documented what that might look like, but it includes a number of sort of shared commitments that David and I were discussing in terms of what we might like to sort of say as an ICS is committing to with regards to scrutiny. So we've got there that we welcome scrutiny because it helps us fulfill our role successfully and aid our development. This is something that's really going to be able to do that. A commitment to work openly and transparently. Also to try and keep things as simple as possible, which with all the 3-letter acronyms and all the double speak that can exist with this stuff is sometimes easier said than done, but trying to make this work in its ways as transparently as possible. Having relationships and those can be on formal meetings, having that ongoing relationship of development and shared learning. And I think sort of key to the whole development of the ICS, proactively seeking out a range of views, perspectives and voices to aid development, which I think scrutiny is a really important part. So I don't want to be taking too much time to sort of listen stuff and to stop to work through it.
Okay, thank you very much, David. So that's really appreciated. Okay, we've got two questions now. We've got a bit of time crunching, and that's for people to sort of restrict it to one question ideally each, and if you have some spare time, people can come back for a second one. Sounds like
well, firstly, I think it's great to see the importance of scrutiny recognised in this way. My question is, on your fifth slide, I am wondering whether Health and Wellbeing Board is in the right column. And I think that's a question which underpins the importance of your success criteria 4 in terms of being clear about roles and responsibilities. Personally, I think there's a big difference between review and scrutiny. And I would say that although scrutiny in some of the papers in 2012, 2013, before the emergence of health and wellbeing boards, did mention a scrutiny role, I think that has gone to the back of the pile since. To me, the role of the Health and Wellbeing Board is about a holistic view of health strategy in the patch, and is about overseeing the development plans to fulfil that strategy. It is about reviewing progress with those plans and against that strategy, rather than scrutiny. And I wonder whether you feel that the role of the Health and Wellbeing Board is different to that, or whether my perception of the difference between review and scrutiny is a bit off key.
So I would agree with you. Maybe my clumsy sort of presentation of this, I think that's a really good, I think I would agree, almost it's almost a textbook definition of what it would look like. I think one of the questions that I had in this is the role of the Health and Wellbeing Board itself changing? And that was kind of the direction of what's going to be happening at place. And I think one of the things around the place-based partnerships that might be developed, I think it's very important that they have a direct relationship with Health and Wellbeing Boards, that the fundamental sort of goal of the Health and Wellbeing Board in terms of overview, bringing things together, overseeing progress and doing that side of stuff, that remains kind of their key role. And I think it's part of legislation that doesn't get touched. So what we're trying to kind of work around is, and maybe I haven't expressed it that well, which I will take on board and happy to amend. But I think part of what we're trying to do is make sure that through these creation of these new groups, they're very respectful of the relationship with the existing groups and not trying to create double working or new roles.
And in terms of that, we've been very, very conscious that the feedback we've had from officers and members on the Health and Wellbeing Boards is just do not duplicate. So, for example, we are expecting, and we've got agreement in principle, so we're working through, that the elected members who chair the Health and Wellbeing Boards will chair the place boards. And we're just trying to think through how best those place boards are used to further bridge that democratic deficit and have some of those very open discussions about delivering It's a local level from the health service, from the health service. So some of the issues that Paul was asking out earlier, for example, in terms of, well, where are you on your 104-week rate? I see that going to the Health and Wellbeing Board. So what does that look like in Birmingham? What does it look like in Solihull? What is the usage of the facilities like there? And we try to work that through at the moment. We desperately do not want to duplicate or undermine the current Health and Wellbeing Board, but to build on that, actually bridge that what I think has been the democratic deficit to along in terms of health and wellbeing.
Yes, thanks, Chair. Just a brief comment. I've got a number of other questions which I will email to the Chair to send that through. Just highlight a couple of points though. Critical success factor 3, strong relationships. I think the key word in there is trust. Establish trust between the parties, certainly between ourselves and the other partners in the ICS. The second aspect is data. Data and information. Maybe need a little bit more in here about the sharing of data, performance data and financial data and all those statistical reports which we get, which we need to establish communication between us, communicating that format of information. And the final point is about subsidiarity. I think you bang on the button there. It maybe needs emphasising a little bit more in the success factors. But if we look at ways of working, clearly there's got to be a way of working of the joint costs with the highest geographical level of life. Then there is ways of working of the individual local authority costs, presumably not at the place level. Birmingham, we have a third factor to consider here, which is the locality, which is an issue for us actually, as to how far we as a Birmingham HOSC can effectively play a part at that locality level. Particularly, I think, because the guidance that there is both from the LGA and I think from NHS is that this is to be created in the bottom up and not imposed as a sort of standard 2 constituencies equals 1 locality type model. I think we've got a lot of work to do to see how our Birmingham locality world builds up. Probably not so much of a problem in Solihull, but I think those 3 things of work still to do, and it's great progress, and thank you very much for undertaking the work.
Yes, on that point of trust, I think that's such an important theme in this, and something else I probably didn't touch on specifically there, but another term that you hear quite a lot is critical friend. I think that's kind of an interesting sort of lens to take as well. And I think another thing around that is also curious, like a curious friend, somebody who's kind of really interested in getting under the skin, and that came through very clearly in the guidance that those are qualities that really help.
Thank you very much. So I could have lots to say about this, but I'll be brief. Thank you for the presentation. It was really good to see the work that's gone into that, and I absolutely agree about the democratic deficit of health and your thoughts about trying to address that. It's interesting and perhaps a little disappointing to hear that health colleagues view scrutiny as an unpleasant experience, perhaps. I can only talk myself. I hope that my colleagues here share the idea that we'd always rather have that openness and transparency and to talk about what's going on and what could be done to improve things, rather than it just being an opportunity to pull people over the coals. And that's really, not from my perspective, not what this is about. And again, to your point about risk taking, I think my view is that scrutiny should be here to help to enable that, to help to add that feedback from the experiences and thoughts of the people that we represent into that process, in order to help make the system better. So I suppose my reflection is to agree with the things that you've said there, and with the idea that this should be the direction we're going in. A quick observation is that sometimes it can feel quite difficult to get some of those thoughts and experiences of the people that we're representing onto the scrutiny agenda. And I wonder whether there's some work to be done there around the agenda setting process, and how that can maybe be made a little bit more representative.
And I think they're very good points. I was talking to the Chief Executive of Health Watch yesterday about how they may well be represented in this. For example, I think they're not members of the board, but they will be participants of the ICB board. And we were talking about how they, at each layer of the integrated care system, actually implement this to get that patient voice. But, you know, I think it's a well-made point. How do you curate a meeting to make sure it's the most benefit the outcomes of the population? You know, that's really what we're all trying to do, isn't it?
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, for the presentation.
Just a quick
one.
Yeah, just a very quick one. I'd like to thank Councillor Burcroft, sort of mentioned about localities, and my thanks to Councillor Sexton, because you're quite right about openness and transparency, and we're looking for improvements. After all, with ONS, we are a critical friend. We're all working together on that. And my final one is looking at the ways of working document, etc. Place-based partnerships. I just wondered whether the West Midlands Combined Authority of their health is involved in this as well.
So we do link into the West Midlands Combined Authority through two ways. They've got a health sub. Forgive me, I don't know the two phrases. There's a health subcommittee which we link into as an ICB, but also Andy Street does hold a one-to-one with all the ICB chairs. So, and I know he's done that with their needs already, who does that regulation. This is health subcommittee or health group of the, yeah, so
Yes, that's just interesting in the health board. My colleague is the secretary, is the chair of that. Thank you.
Thank you. This is sort of the conclusion note. It says in the documentation that we come in the statutory body in April 22. Still correct. I just wondered if there'd be a potential of coming back to the next meeting on the 10th of March, which I think is across the Solihull to give an update.
I just want to get a couple of comments just before the subject. Just sort of picking up the fact that two scrutiny boards have their own terms of reference, and we operate sort of fairly independent thinking on the topics from the work plans that are of interest and concern to our residents. So I take it that will continue to be respected, so that we can get some we've got to say differing health watch sets of data and things like that. We tend to generate different questions.
Oh, absolutely, and as I said, subsidiarity is a key principle. So what works best in Solihull will not necessarily work best in Birmingham, and vice versa. So we're building on what's there rather than changing.
Okay.
So would it be possible, as I say, to come on the 10th of March update?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. And we do have a report, so it was written behind us, which we shared with draft with the officers, which we could finalise. And members can have that as well, so you can see our commitment in the NHS in terms of resilience.
So, thank you for your report. It's been really useful there. Can I just say in conclusion that the next meeting is going to take place on Thursday the 10th at 4 o'clock at a simple suite in Solihull. And can I thank everybody for their time and wish them a happy Christmas and New Year. I look forward to seeing everybody in March. Thank you all. Thank you.